Have you ever noticed how silence can feel louder than words after someone you love walks away? Not just quiet silence, but the kind of silence that presses on your chest. The kind that makes you stare at your phone even when you already know nothing is coming. The kind that turns ordinary moments into emotional weight you cannot explain. This is where the story truly begins. Not with arguments, not with the breakup itself, but with what comes after it, the silence. When someone leaves your life, your mind does not accept it instantly. The brain resists reality. It keeps expecting patterns that are no longer there, a message that does not arrive, a call that does not come, a presence that suddenly disappeared. And this creates a strange emotional loop. You start checking your phone more than you admit, you refresh conversations that will not change, you replay memories like your mind is trying to solve a puzzle that has no answer, and every time nothing happens, it hurts a little more. But the most powerful part is this: your brain is not just reacting emotionally, it is reacting chemically. When you care about someone, your mind builds a reward system around them. Their attention, their messages, their presence, they all become emotional rewards. And when that reward is suddenly removed, the brain does not stay calm. It panics, it searches, it creates hope out of small things. A last seen status, a memory, a possibility that maybe they will come back. This is not weakness, this is human psychology, and this is exactly why the silence feels unbearable. Because silence is not empty. Silence is filled with expectation. An expectation without fulfillment creates emotional pain. Now, after a breakup with an avoidant ex, this pain becomes even more confusing because there is no clear ending, no full closure, no emotional explanation that satisfies your mind. Just distance, just withdrawal, just a sudden shift from closeness to nothing. And the human brain struggles most with unclear endings. We are not designed to handle emotional uncertainty well. We want answers, we want reasons, we want meaning. So when we don't get it, the mind creates its own stories. You start asking questions like, what did I do wrong? Did they ever care? Are they thinking about me right now? Why did they become so distant so fast? And every question keeps you emotionally tied to the silence. This is the hidden trap. The silence is not just the absence of communication. It becomes a space where your thoughts start fighting themselves. One part of you hopes, the other part fears, and both parts keep you stuck in the same emotional place. This is why nights feel heavier than days. Because at night, distractions disappear. And what remains is your thoughts, louder than ever. You remember moments that felt warm. You remember words that now feel confusing. And you try to find meaning in memories that no longer have direction. But here is something most people don't realize. This silence is not only breaking you down, it is also revealing something about you. It is showing how deeply you can feel, how strongly you attach, how much meaning you give to connection. And even though it hurts, it proves something important. You are not emotionally empty. You are emotionally aware. And awareness feels painful when it has nowhere to go. Now, if you are watching this, there is something you need to understand before anything else. This stage you are in right now is not the final stage. It feels permanent, but it is not. It feels like the end, but it is actually the beginning of something very different, because silence always has two effects. It either breaks you further, or it starts rebuilding you in ways you do not notice yet. And what determines the outcome is not what they do. It is what you stop doing. In the next part of this journey, you will start to understand why your reactions after silence matter more than the breakup itself. You will see how avoidant behavior works on a psychological level and why chasing changes everything in ways most people never realize. But for now, stay with this understanding. Silence is not just absence. It is a powerful emotional space where your mind is being tested in ways you cannot see yet. And if you continue watching, you will discover something important about this silence. Something that most people only understand too late. What happens next is where most people quietly get trapped without even realizing it. After the initial emotional shock settles, the mind does not move toward acceptance. It moves toward interpretation. It tries to build meaning out of something that feels incomplete. It refuses to believe that something once emotionally significant could simply end without further explanation. So instead of letting go, the mind starts filling gaps. It begins to rewrite reality in small, subtle ways. At first, there is confusion, not the loud kind, but a slow internal disorientation. One moment, everything felt connected. The next moment, everything became distant. And because there is no clear emotional transition, the brain struggles to accept the shift as final. This is where hope quietly enters, not as a decision, but as a reflex. A message that might come, a change of heart that could happen, a misunderstanding that might get fixed. These thoughts do not feel imagined. They feel reasonable, almost logical, because the mind always prefers a hopeful explanation over a painful conclusion. And that is where emotional attachment becomes complicated. When someone matters deeply, the brain stores their presence as a pattern. It expects continuation. So when that pattern suddenly breaks, the mind does not immediately accept loss. Instead, it searches for continuity in fragments. A memory becomes evidence. A past moment becomes reassurance. Even distance becomes something temporary in your interpretation. This is not intentional self-deception. It is the attachment system trying to protect emotional balance. But there is another layer that begins to form at the same time. The mind starts selectively focusing on positive memories. Not because the negative ones disappear, but because emotional longing naturally filters them out. Painful details lose weight, while comforting moments gain intensity. Over time, the memory becomes less about reality and more about emotional preference. This is how idealization begins. The person is no longer remembered as they were in full complexity. They are remembered in emotional highlights. The laughter feels stronger in memory than the arguments. The closeness feels more consistent than the distance that may have existed before. And this shift changes everything internally, because now the absence feels like loss of something perfect, even if reality was more balanced. At this stage, the mind also begins negotiating with itself. It creates internal conditions for return. If they message, everything will be different. If they explain, everything will make sense. If there is one more chance, things will improve. This is not planning, it is bargaining. A psychological attempt to regain control over something that feels uncontrollable. The emotional system does this because uncertainty is difficult to tolerate. So it creates scenarios where uncertainty gets resolved, even if those scenarios are not grounded in present reality. Meanwhile, another process is quietly running in the background. Expectation becomes habit. Every small trigger starts carrying meaning. A notification sound, a familiar name appearing online. Even random coincidences start feeling significant. The brain begins connecting unrelated signals to emotional possibility. This is where emotional dependency becomes stronger without direct contact, because the system is no longer relying on interaction. It is relying on anticipation. And anticipation is powerful. It keeps attention locked forward. It prevents emotional closure. It maintains a sense of something still unresolved. For someone with avoidant behavior patterns, this dynamic becomes even more confusing on your side because their withdrawal often lacks emotional clarity. There is no structured explanation that allows the mind to settle, just distance that feels unexplained. And the human mind struggles more with unclear endings than with painful truths. Pain can be processed. Uncertainty keeps the system active. So instead of calming down, thoughts become repetitive. The same scenarios replay in different forms. The same questions appear in different emotional tones. It feels like thinking, but it is actually looping. This looping creates emotional fatigue, not because of what happened, but because of what is imagined repeatedly. And in the middle of all this, hope remains the strongest force, because hope does not require evidence. It only requires possibility. And as long as possibility exists, the mind does not fully release emotional investment. That is why even small signs feel amplified. A short interaction in the past gets reinterpreted as significance. A kind moment gets treated as proof of lingering connection. The emotional system looks for confirmation, not balance. But here is the deeper truth hidden inside this phase. What feels like attachment to the person is often attachment to the emotional state they created within you. The sense of connection, the feeling of importance, the identity you experienced while being part of that dynamic. So when they are gone, it is not just their absence you feel, It is the absence of the version of yourself that existed in that connection. And that is why letting go feels so difficult at this stage. Because the mind is not only holding on to a person, it is holding on to an emotional identity that has not been replaced yet. This is the point where most people either get stuck for a long time or slowly begin shifting without realizing it. Because underneath confusion and hope, another process is quietly starting. Reality is beginning to show itself in small cracks. And in the next part of this journey, those cracks become impossible to ignore, revealing how attachment behaves differently in emotional distance, and why pulling away changes the entire psychological structure over time. And then something subtle begins to unfold that changes the entire meaning of what just happened. What looked like sudden emotional disappearance is not as simple as it appears on the surface. There is a different internal mechanism operating underneath it, one that is driven less by feelings themselves and more by how emotional intensity is processed in the mind and body. Some individuals experience closeness as something deeply stimulating at first. Connection feels natural, even comforting. But as emotional depth increases, another response gets activated inside them. The system that is responsible for internal balance begins to feel overloaded. What once felt safe slowly starts to feel like pressure. And when that pressure crosses a certain threshold, the response is not negotiation, it is distance. Not because connection has no value, but because the internal system is trying to restore equilibrium. This is where a specific pattern begins to form. Instead of moving toward emotional engagement when intensity rises, the mind shifts into protection mode. The focus turns inward. Emotional signals get reduced. Sensitivity becomes muted. This is not a conscious decision. It is an automatic regulation response designed to prevent emotional overwhelm. In simple terms, when feelings become too strong, the system reduces exposure to them. This is often misunderstood as lack of care, but that interpretation misses the deeper structure. The emotional capacity is not absent. It is regulated through separation when intensity feels unsustainable. At the same time, another process activates internally. The sense of personal space becomes highly valuable. Autonomy, independence, and mental clarity start to feel essential again. Any emotional demand, even if it is gentle, can begin to feel like pressure, simply because it interrupts that need for internal control. So what appears externally as withdrawal is actually an attempt to regain internal stability. There is also a neurological layer behind this response. When emotional closeness increases, the nervous system can interpret it as a form of threat if it is not balanced with enough space. The body shifts into a protective state. Energy moves away from emotional openness and towards self-regulation. Thoughts become more focused on reducing stimulation rather than deepening connection. From the outside, this can look like detachment, but internally, it is more about calming an activated system than rejecting a person. Another important aspect is how emotions are managed internally. Instead of expressing intensity outwardly, feelings are often contained within. They are analyzed, compartmentalized, or pushed into separate mental sections. Logic becomes a tool to organize emotional complexity. This creates an appearance of calmness, even when internal processing is active. Because of this structure, emotional buildup does not always show in visible ways. It accumulates internally until the system decides it needs space. And when space is taken, the intensity decreases, creating a sense of relief. That relief is important to understand because after emotional distance is created, the mind experiences a reduction in pressure. The absence of intensity feels stabilizing. The system settles. Thoughts become lighter. Emotional weight decreases. This phase is often mistaken as final clarity, but it is actually a reset state. However, emotional systems do not erase connection. They pause it. So over time, as external stimulation decreases, stored emotional impressions begin to re-emerge in quieter ways. Not immediately and not always clearly, but gradually. Memories, familiarity, and emotional imprints begin to resurface once the system is no longer overloaded. This is where time starts playing a different role. With enough distance, emotional processing changes direction. What once felt overwhelming becomes more neutral. What once felt intense becomes more understandable. The mind gains space to reflect without pressure, and reflection often leads to reinterpretation. But this process does not move in a straight line. It fluctuates. It shifts between distance and reflection, between clarity and withdrawal. Emotional reopening is not constant. It happens in phases depending on internal stability. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this dynamic is how external pursuit interacts with it. When emotional intensity is reintroduced too quickly from the outside, it does not create reconnection. Instead, it reactivates the same internal protection system that caused distance in the first place. The system interprets renewed pressure as a return of overload, which strengthens the need for separation again. This is why timing becomes crucial, because the internal structure responds more to perceived pressure than to emotional intent. Even genuine care can be interpreted as intensity if it arrives without balance. Inside this pattern, there is also a tendency toward delayed emotional recognition. Feelings are not always processed in real time. They are often understood after distance has already been created. Once the nervous system is calm, emotional clarity becomes more accessible. But by then, external circumstances may already have changed. This creates a gap between emotional realization and action, a gap that is often filled with silence rather than expression. And within that silence, the other side often misreads what is happening, assuming absence means conclusion, when in reality, internal processing may still be unfolding in a slower rhythm. What matters most here is understanding that this structure does not operate through constant emotional engagement. It operates through cycles of activation and withdrawal, closeness and regulation, connection and distance. And without recognizing this rhythm, interactions often become misaligned, leading to repeated cycles of approach and retreat. This is where most emotional confusion intensifies, because each side is responding from a different internal logic. One system seeks continuity through expression, while the other seeks stability through distance. And when these two systems collide without awareness, pressure builds on both sides, even when intention is not harmful. At this point in the process, the real turning point is not about changing the other person. It is about understanding how these internal responses are structured, because once this becomes clear, the next layer of behavior begins to make sense in a completely different way. And in the next section, the focus shifts toward what happens when no contact is maintained long enough for this system to settle, and why time itself becomes a silent force that changes emotional perception in ways most people do not expect. And now, something shifts again, but this time it is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible at first. When communication stops completely, the emotional system does not instantly shut down. It continues to react for a while, like an echo that slowly fades. At the beginning, there is still internal movement. Thoughts are active. Emotional energy is unstable. The mind keeps reaching toward familiar patterns, even when nothing responds. But over time, something important happens. The intensity begins to lose momentum. Not because feelings vanish, but because stimulation is no longer being refreshed. Emotional energy depends on input. When input stops, the system starts using stored energy instead of generating new spikes. This changes everything internally. At first, this feels uncomfortable. The absence of response creates a sense of imbalance. The mind is used to feedback, even if that feedback was inconsistent or emotionally charged. Without it, there is a strange emptiness that does not yet feel peaceful. But this stage is temporary. As days pass, the nervous system begins to adjust. The constant alertness starts to decrease. Emotional reactions become less immediate. Thoughts still appear, but they no longer carry the same urgency. The system is slowly learning that nothing new is coming from the outside. And when that realization settles, something subtle begins to form: mental space. This space is not empty in a negative sense. It is a reduction of internal noise. The emotional system is no longer reacting to every small trigger. Instead, it starts organizing experiences differently. Memories are no longer mixed with immediate emotional pressure. They begin to separate from urgency. This separation is what allows time to work in a deeper way, because time does not heal by erasing. It heals by reorganizing perception. What once felt overwhelming starts to lose sharpness. Not because it becomes less meaningful, but because it becomes less active in the present moment. Emotional intensity is tied to immediacy. When immediacy disappears, intensity softens. This is where perception starts to shift. Events that once felt absolute begin to feel less fixed. The mind gains distance, not physically but psychologically, and with distance comes a new kind of interpretation. Situations that were once seen through emotional urgency are now viewed with reduced pressure. This reduction allows reflection to appear naturally. Without constant emotional interruption, the brain starts comparing past experiences with present absence. It begins to notice contrast more clearly. What was once taken for granted becomes more visible in hindsight, but this awareness does not arrive through force. It emerges gradually. Meanwhile, another process unfolds quietly in the background. Familiar emotional patterns start to weaken, not disappear, but weaken. The brain is built on repetition. When a pattern is repeated often, it becomes automatic. When repetition stops, the pattern begins to lose strength. Emotional responses tied to specific people or situations slowly reduce in frequency. The mind no longer activates the same reactions as quickly as before. This is not forgetting, it is recalibration. During this recalibration, the nervous system becomes more balanced. Emotional spikes become less extreme. Internal stability increases, and as stability increases, clarity becomes more accessible. Thoughts that were once clouded by urgency now have room to settle. But here is the most important part of this stage. Silence changes interpretation. When interaction is absent for long enough, the mind is forced to fill gaps with internal reasoning instead of external feedback. This creates a shift from reaction to understanding. The focus moves from what is happening externally to what it means internally, and meaning changes over time. What once felt like rejection may later be seen as distance. What once felt like loss may later be seen as transition. What once felt confusing may later become understandable through perspective. This does not happen because reality changes, but because perception matures under reduced emotional pressure. Time plays a critical role here, because time does not just move forward, it reshapes emotional relevance. The brain prioritizes what is active in the present. When something is no longer active, it slowly moves into the background. This does not erase significance, but it changes its emotional weight. And as weight decreases, interpretation becomes more flexible. This flexibility is where real psychological change begins, because once emotional rigidity loosens, the mind can explore different perspectives without resistance. It can revisit memories without being overwhelmed. It can acknowledge experiences without being controlled by them. This is where understanding replaces reaction. However, this process does not move evenly for everyone. It depends on internal stability, emotional resilience, and the ability to tolerate uncertainty without filling it immediately with assumptions. For some, this stage brings clarity quickly. For others, it takes longer cycles of distance and reflection before the same shift occurs. But regardless of timing, the direction remains consistent. Less reaction, more awareness, less urgency, more observation, and in this shift, something important becomes possible. Emotional detachment from immediate intensity does not mean emotional disappearance. It means emotional reorganization. Feelings are no longer tied to constant stimulation. They begin to exist in a more stable form, separate from reactive cycles. This is where time becomes a silent influence rather than an active force. Because it is no longer about waiting, it is about transformation occurring in the absence of interference. And within this transformation, the mind starts preparing for a different kind of understanding, one that is not driven by emotional urgency, but by internal clarity that develops naturally when pressure is removed. In the next section, this shift becomes even more noticeable as the psychological effects of sustained distance begin to reveal how perception of value, connection, and emotional relevance changes when silence is no longer resisted, but experienced fully.